the world has been shut down for everybody for 3 months. What have you been doing in the stand-up comedy world? Like, I saw you and Schaub did something in Texas. Bert Kreischer's going to do drive-in movie theaters, from what I've been told. What is the idea and what is the roadmap going forward here?
Listen, man, the show must go on. The bottom line is, people on Instagram were like, "What? You're not saying anything about the protests and the shutdown." And I'm like, "Hey, man, that nobody needs to hear from me right now. I think I'll take a back seat and shut up for a while. And what I do well is I'm a professional jackass. So I consider myself recess. If you learn a couple things from my subtle, nuanced comedy, all right. But for the most part, I'm just here to try to make you laugh. That's what I'm good at. So I try to just stick to that the best I can do. I mean, we went to Houston, man. And it was 75% capacity, but it was so cathartic. It was just so much fun to watch. And by the way, it was when they were actually protesting and stuff like that. So it was an emotional, heavy time. But when you're up there for an hour, that's your job is just to make people laugh. And so that to me is a privilege. I always feel like I'm of service, if you will. That's the best I can do. I don't know what else to do, man. My cure for COVID isn't coming along so well in my garage. I'm not that good at chemistry. You know what I mean?
Get to it.
I can't go to the protest and be like, guys, I'm a 53-year-old white guy. The argument's a little more nuanced. We're actually making progress. Nobody wants to hear that right now. So what I can do is be an idiot. So
is that your COVID-19 cure in the garage, by the way, I think is a great way to look at it. At least you're trying to help, obviously. But is your content now, is your stories, is it all going to be about this world that we are in? I assume that there's a lot of things for you to talk about for people, and they're going to want to hear as the theaters and clubs and things of that nature start opening back up.
Well, it's funny because before all of this stuff, I'm with Rogan. I'm sitting there with Joe Rogan and Schaub. And we were at the Comedy Store, and I'm talking about, I'm talking about my theory of evolution. I'm talking about whoever invented something. I'm talking about something really light, like whoever designed the giraffe is not the same guy that designed the rhino, because giraffes are basically gay camels, and blah blah blah, ha ha ha. We're joking around, and then Rogan says, "Hey, dude, I was talking to Dana White, and Dana White kind of like suggested to the president, maybe just shut down for 2 weeks." And me and Schaub and Rogan were like, "Can you imagine shut down for 2 weeks? Imagine if they shut the whole country down for 2 weeks." And we're like, ha ha ha, never happened. Well, here we are 4 months later. So what happens as a comic is that you have all this silly material on, say, giraffes or whatever. And then the world catches fire. And I can't just go. The world is so different 4 months later. I can't just go with the old stuff. So I found myself writing, and in Houston I did. I have almost 40 minutes of new material. I have to, because it's what I'm thinking about, and more importantly, it's more of an emotional state. It's hard not to be affected by everything. It's hard not to be afraid by what's going on. It's hard not to be worried. It's hard not to be worried about your children. And what kind of a world are we inheriting? And is this good? I hope it is. But the protesters marched literally past my door here in Venice, so it's very close. So it's impossible for that not to color your expression. I think any comic worth his salt has got to be a little bit in the business of satire, but also in the business of truth and illumination without getting too heavy about it.
Well, and comedians, this is Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, why Jerry Seinfeld said he enjoys talking to comedians. The brain of a comedian operates in a completely different fashion. You have to hit something at an angle that nobody else is hitting it. The act of surprise or the narrative that you're going to paint is something very, very different. I would assume that a lot of comedians are going to take this as like almost a challenge. Like, okay, we have a job to do in our society, which is hopefully make light of situations. But right now, there's not a lot of situations that you can just make light about because there's some real conversations happening, man. It's a fine balance, I'd assume.
I always think about, there was a story about these guys. They were hostages. They were being held hostage. I can't remember the exact situation. And what they were doing was they were telling jokes because that's all they had. And so I think sometimes the two things that go on for comics. One is you have to be careful what you say nowadays. If you're in the workplace or whatever, even expressing a point of view that can be fairly innocuous can be taken the wrong way. It can catch fire, and you can be out of a job. But the problem is, if you say that to comedians, if you put comedians in those dangerous waters, I promise you, it's probably the best thing for comedy. Because the minute you tell me I can't say something, when I do a corporate gig and they tell me I can't swear, it's the worst thing you can do. Because now we're going to have a huge problem. Because I'm definitely going to, I'm bringing out all the words. And now, because things are so delicate and taboo, just come to the Comedy Store in about 6 months and come tell me how respectful all the comedians of all different colors and sexes and shades are going to be treating this. The great thing about comedy is once things die down, and the great thing about Americans is that we kind of default. We default to the middle. We default in the gray area. This country is an experiment. People have to remember that. This great republic of ours, this great country of ours, is a great country because we're not a noun. The United States of America is an experiment. It is a verb. It's a beautiful idea. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. I know that was written by men who owned slaves, but what it means and the power of it is that, we're all of the same moral worth. That's what these protests and these things are about. At the end of the day, all of us know that's the argument that wins. You can't prove it. You can't prove it biologically and mathematically. But we know that when you have a society that's based on the idea that all men are created equal, you get the goodies, man. You need some irreverence. You need to be able to speak truth to power, because what happens is that is where innovation comes from. You've always got to be able to give the middle finger to the people, the higher ups, the people that are in charge. If you don't, you'll get China. So irreverence, man. Irreverence is so important to the American spirit. And Americans are always wary of their government, on the right and the left. And that's not a bad thing. You should be suspicious. You should treat your government and your leaders as a necessary evil, not some huge engine for good. And I think that's inherent in the American spirit, and it's certainly inherent in comedy. The reason comedy, look, improv and stand-up comedy is an American and maybe a British, but definitely an American art form. Why? Because we are an irreverent people. And so the job of a comedian is not just to make people laugh. It's to make people think, and it's to disturb. It's to shake you up. That's why we love Bill Burr. That's why we love Chris Rock.
Chappelle, you name it.
Chappelle, man. Chappelle, what a classic example. This is not an accident that all of us go, that guy's a genius. Why? Because he says things worth thinking. Because he says things that we didn't know we could say out loud. That's courageous. So that's where original self-expression, original comedy is invaluable, especially in a time like this.